Hey, good morning. Scott Luton with you here on This Week in Business History. Welcome to today's show. We're departing from the script again on this episode. Traditionally, I pick several stories from business history, especially ones that offer important lessons that we can learn, right, from the annals of business history. But today, we are featuring a great mind and a great friend and someone else's point of view for a change as we take a look back primarily on 2020 and key business lessons learned. So quick programming note, not enough coffee just yet, Troy. Hey, if you like this conversation, be sure to find This Week in Business History and subscribe for free so you don't miss conversations just like this. Find us across social media. Hey, send your feedback. We'd love to hear from our listeners. Okay, no further ado. I want to introduce our featured guest here today. After graduating with his bachelor's in mechanical engineering from Notre Dame, he got his start at General Electric, an iconic business brand. He led a team of over 100 associates. Later, our guest managed a business portfolio valued at over $200 million. Who can relate to that? While earning his MBA from the University of Georgia, his doctorate in business administration from the University of South Florida, our guest has spent 15 to 20 years, I must say, in banking, healthcare, and consulting. When not teaching and giving back to the current incredibly sharp future business leaders, global business leaders that are matriculating through the University of Georgia, he's coaching and consulting with organizations looking to drive successful change. So join me in welcoming Dr. Troy Montgomery, faculty member with the Terry College of Business at UGA and managing partner of SC&E Partners. Troy, how you doing, sir?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on the show, Scott.
You bet. It took me several hours, all that you've done, and try to capture some bullet points there. So I really appreciate you bringing your wealth of knowledge and experience to the show here today. And as I mentioned on the front end, it's really neat. I think we've done probably about 45 or so episodes here at This Week in Business History. And we've had several guest hosts and a guest or two. And I always find it fascinating to kind of bring what they have learned from recent or far past history and kind of bringing those key takeaways to where we are today. So I'm really excited to have you here to share similar key takeaways.
Yeah, and Scott, there's plenty of talk about when you think about just the last year alone, and there's plenty of learnings that I think we're going to take away, and things that are just going to change from here on out. So plenty to talk about when we talk about history just being a year ago as well.
I'm with you. So, and that really, on that note, and before we dive into some of your key thoughts, that's been one of the great silver linings about this age we're living in. Whether it is the recognition of all these incredible frontline folks, healthcare, retail, supply chain, you name it, that have really helped move the whole world forward, or all these lessons learned that whether you're business schools or CEOs or whatever, you're going to be studying this age. I mean, it's already changed so many aspects of business that, some are short-term changes, some are permanent changes. So we're going to be studying this time frame. It's going to offer a lot of learnings to leaders around the world. So on that note, Troy, I really enjoy seeing you in action, especially on the education side. So, educate us and our listenership. What are some of the key things that stick out from the year that was 2020?
Well, a few things right off the top, and I think that most of us are aware of when we think about supply chain, and that is the trend shifting to a significant reduction in lead time. And so we saw that before the pandemic, right? And there's plenty of survey information out there, but one that I thought was pretty interesting came from the 2018 survey that said about roughly 10 respondents said that speed was the most important thing when it came to shipping and logistics. And then in 2019, and this is before the pandemic, right, it was up to closer to 20%. So that's a significant shift in change. And then we're seeing that even more in 2020. Companies like Peloton. So you talk about the learnings that we have in my undergraduate and graduate supply chain management courses. We look at the book, we look at the text, we look at the theories, but then we look at what's actually going on right now. Because we don't have all the answers. And one of the many cases that we just recently looked at was Peloton. And I think we're all familiar with the fitness company, and they've got the nice bikes and treads that
they're doing pretty well.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, my in-laws recently purchased one. They ordered it back in November, and it was just delivered in February. So they're having a huge issue with their supply chain and really manufacturing base being over in Asia and getting the product over here with everything that's gummed up and shipping and the issues that they're seeing. But again, flexibility being one of the most important things to companies and individuals right now. Cost is still the primary focus when we talk about shipping and logistics, but speed is becoming more and more important. So when we look at Peloton, they're spending roughly 10 times more per bike to get it over here than they did a few months ago because they're shipping via air carrier. So that's just one example where we're seeing, a huge shift due to the pandemic, but also due to the trend of this lead time becoming more and more important.
Speaking of Peloton and speaking of lessons that will keep or teachable moments that will keep giving for years to come, their CEO, I believe it came from their CEO, put out what's become a famous communication via email, which he or she went into all of the different reasons for the challenges and including, they mentioned they're spending $100 million in expediting freight. And they have, as you know, they have acquired a manufacturer here in North Carolina, in the States, to help get around some of these shipping issues. So it really is that memo alone is such a great supply chain case study for what 2020 has brought.
Yeah, and your point there with bringing the manufacturing onshore. So they bought a company called Precor for about $420 million that is a U.S. manufacturer of fitness equipment. So North Carolina and then Washington is where they plan to start to build some of these treads and bikes. And that's just one example, right, Scott? I mean, we're seeing other companies take that same type of strategy where previously they're offshore, they're in Asia, and not just the pandemic, but other pressures related to tariffs and uncertainties when it comes to things like tariff and how the new administration is going to treat the global economy. So we're seeing more of that onshoring. And I was also talking with a flooring company, Mohawk, that's local in Georgia here. And they're talking about some of the same type strategies where they've got, global suppliers. How can we get it here quicker? Is the answer to move to different suppliers? These are a lot of the questions that have only been exacerbated by the pandemic in 2020. And it's great to have these cases because students don't have the answers. I don't have the answers, but let's talk through it and let's utilize some of those skill sets that we're learning in supply chain management.
I love it. Two quick points there. You mentioned Mohawk and flooring. And many folks may not know just how much flooring production takes place in the state of Georgia, including Dalton, Georgia, which by many accounts I believe is still deemed the carpet capital of the world or something like that. So that's an important industry here in the state of Georgia. And then one other thing, as you mentioned, reshoring, that is important for the years to come, especially in the information age where we all have our favorite devices, just within our reach. Semiconductors. I think that has been offshore for so long. So many major players have kind of outsourced that. Well, now we're seeing major plants being planned. Of course, it's not going to solve anything overnight because these massive, 10 million square feet facilities take a long time to set up and get production running. But we're seeing more investment here and bringing some of that production here stateside, which may help prevent some of the things we're seeing, like right now with automotive production lines being slowed down or even stopped due to some of the shortages we're seeing. So I love, hey, we're starting on a strong note, Troy. So you've set the bar high already. So what else sticks out from 2020?
Yeah, so keeping with that type of thought process around lead time, it's kind of a bigger trend than that. It's companies are focused more on responsiveness and being flexible within their supply chain. So there's really two parts of this. One is being flexible, and then the second part is trying to reduce risk. And in order to reduce risk, first you got to identify it. So thinking first on the responsiveness and flexibility. I love to have guest speakers come into the class. Scott was gracious enough to come in the class a couple years ago as well. But recently I had Fred Tolbert. He comes in every year and works for Demand Solutions, so a software company.
Troy, you know what his nickname is that was coined by Greg White, right?
Probably Mr. Supply Chain. Is that right?
Close. There's one of those already in our friend Daniel Stanton. But Fred Tolbert is the Doc Holliday of supply chain because he tells it like it is. So we've had so much fun. He is such a wonderful person to collaborate with. But so he came in and spoke to your class as well.
Yeah, and one of the things he talked about towards the end of our time together, and it came up in a question and answer, is about forecasting and how do we forecast with this pandemic? What's going to happen next? And so he talked more about demand sensing, which is looking at a shorter time frame into the future. As opposed to looking towards next year, we're looking at smaller chunks. And organizations are having to do that right now and react much quicker to the pace of change when it comes to demand. Another strategy which we hear often about. So Georgia Pacific is another company that comes in and speaks to my class. And Matthew Lee's a former student at UGA, and Anat Patel. They came in and they talked about SKU rationalization. And I think within supply chain, this isn't new, but it's actually happening now. So when I was sitting in meetings at GE a number of years ago, we talked about reducing the amount of SKUs. Marketing wanted more SKUs, sales wanted more SKUs, but manufacturing wanted less. And we typically didn't win in those conversations back in those days, but now we're seeing that, and it's critical to ensure that you've got the product in place, is that you're focusing on a smaller amount of SKUs and a smaller amount of products. And for Georgia Pacific, and you think about toilet paper and paper towels in particular, it's really very similar product in just different packages. So it's not as hard of a conversation to say, well, let's limit the amount of different packages we have. Instead of having all these different 12-roll packs, let's focus on one 12-roll pack or just a few of those. So again, all of these conversations that we're hearing from our leaders in business are coming back to the necessity of having flexibility and responsiveness in their supply chains.
You know, when I think of SKU rationalization, that's been such a big theme in supply chain, especially in the last 18 months or so. I wish more industries and sectors had a freestyle machine. It was, as someone, I'm a big fan of caffeine-free Diet Cherry Coke, right? One of those very niche products that probably not, I don't know. I haven't met a whole bunch of similar fans, but this freestyle machine that Coke rolled out probably 10 years ago offers just about any drink that you want within their inventory, and it really is so efficient that it doesn't require, to your point, packaging or stocking all these different raw materials. It really offers all these different SKUs in a very efficient and lean way. Now, don't we wish that so much else was that easy, right? It's not. But when it comes to SKU rationalization, what we've seen, global supply chains really limit all these options so they can protect the supply in their core offerings. That really it's been a fascinating study. And to your point, I'm sure plenty of internal wrangling between sales and operations around which SKUs and which ones survive and which ones, are shelved for a little while.
Yeah, and that's a really good strategy, and another strategy which is right along that same line is called postponement, which is not assembling, not pulling together the final product, just like your drink example, until the last minute. And that enables you to offer a significant amount of variation in SKU and customization. And a good example that I often share is with paint. So I love your example, and I'm probably going to steal that one and start sharing it in line with paint. But if you go to Home Depot or Lowe's, it's just white paint. And when you find the color that you want, they mix it right there. So they're not having to hold significant amount of inventory. They're just having to hold the inventory of white paint. But it's that same approach of waiting to the last minute to give the customer the customization that they desire.
I love that. One of the things that comes across that it's been a little while since we sat down and caught up with each other, But I'm instantly reminded as you share your perspective is how lucky your students are, because clearly you're someone that scours what's taking place in the real world right now, today, and bring that into the classroom, even when it's problems that are still being worked out where there is no obvious answers, and even the experts have no answer, and then facilitating a discussion with students that may have the answers. I mean, that's the kind of I think of Dan Berry, who I learned from at University of South Carolina. He was a furniture entrepreneur with 3 stores that where he made his living and did well, and then he gave back as an adjunct professor, and he brought all what's really taking place, right into the classroom and let us talk and work it through, even when there were no obvious answers. Those are the folks that you want to learn from. And Troy, you strike me as someone in the vein of Dan Berry.
Well, and I'm glad that you said it, so I appreciate that, because one of my goals as an educator is to bring the stories, from my war stories, from my experience, and then also, just like you said, what's actually going on. I was educated at the University of South Florida, where I pursued my doctorate, and Dr. Grandin Gill, Harvard-trained, brilliant guy, one of the foremost leaders when it comes to writing business cases. And I've had the opportunity to train under him and write a business case and a couple business cases. And one of the things that we talk about when you're writing a business case, so think about the Harvard Business Review cases maybe you had as an undergrad or in a master's program, where there's a protagonist and they're faced with some business problem. And they don't give you the answer at the end. It's your chance to come up with a solution. And typically there's no one right answer. There's multiple right answers, which is the case with business. So the key there is, when you're writing a business case, the best business cases to write up don't have the answers yet. So we often think that, whoever wrote the business case for Amazon or Home Depot or whatever it may be had the answer before they wrote it up. But that's not true. The best business cases that you can write up don't have the answer yet, because you end it with a protagonist having to go to a meeting and make a decision, or having to come up with a report and do some analysis and come up with the right solution. So I say all that because the best cases to cover in class are the ones that are going on right now, where you have to think through and there's not a clear answer of what the outcome's going to look like.
Love it. I love that. And of course, we haven't spoken yet about your consulting work that you do. We'll touch on that here towards the end. But one last thought, and I want to make sure we before we move on to some business leader that you admire and have learned from, Jeff Bezos famously went in the earliest years of Amazon, the first couple of years, went and presented to an Ivy League graduate class, and I can't remember which one it was. It was on one of our earlier episodes. And one of the students, after he let them, as he kind of walked them through the model and this, that, and the other, they said, I'm going to paraphrase, "You're a nice guy and all, but this isn't going to work. Folks are going to use Barnes & Noble." Yeah. And it's just that moment. And look, we've all been there. I cringe at some of the things I've shared just in the last probably couple of weeks. But it's those anecdotes make history and business history so fascinating, because, to your point, you just never know. And even when you think you've got the answer and you think you've got it pegged, what's right around the corner is going to surprise you. So
so true.
All right. So looking back, kind of first part of this interview is looking back at 2020. What else, before we move on to some leadership lessons learned, what else sticks out, Troy?
The only other one that I'll share is that even coming out of this pandemic, there's a lot of things that are going to change, but then there's a lot of things that aren't going to change. And that is, customers are still going to demand to get their product as soon as possible. And customers aren't going to want to pay price increases for the additional costs that we incur as an organization within our supply chain. So that just means we're going to have to become even more innovative on how we deliver products, how we produce products, customer service, which gets into a little bit of the consulting side. So through UGA and the Executive Education Program, we've helped develop continuous improvement education through the Yellow Belt and Green Belt, so Lean Six Sigma. But whether it's Lean Six Sigma or other continuous improvement types of tools and techniques, these are going to become more and more important to organizations, because of that fact that customers aren't going to be willing to pay, a significant amount of increase, even though we know on the back end, Peloton's a good example there. We're having to get those products as quick as possible to customers, and we're having to pay for that.
Excellent point. And part of what you were sharing there makes me immediately think of customer experience, right? That the CX we've seen really rise in terms of importance and priority, and how many times you hear it. It's one of those phrases. It's kind of lean 25 years ago, maybe, where all of a sudden it became the word everyone was talking about, and a methodology everyone was talking about. CX. I mean, we've got user experience and employee experience. All those are really important. And now more and more supply chain and business leaders are talking about customer experience, to your point, focused on what they want, but also how they get it, what the process is, what the experience is, obviously, and how we can focus all aspects of business on optimizing that. And so it's fascinating to see where we are and what's that will lead to.
Yeah, when you say see where we are, there's an important fundamental concept that any consulting engagement or any training that I do includes, and that is looking at the current state. And so while a lot of people might kind of glance over this fact, drawing out a simple or detailed process map is extremely important. And in CX, we start to call it journey mapping, looking at the customer and all the experiences that they have from start to finish. When we think about our supply chain, it's more important than ever to identify risks within your supply chain, and that starts with actually mapping it out. And you think about some of these large organizations and how many suppliers that they have, how many products they have, and how complex their supply chain is. It's a significant undertaking just to map it out. Then when you map it out, you start to categorize your risk and identify points where we might need some help here, or we might need to hold a little bit more inventory in this particular instance. But I can't stress that enough, whether it's in looking at customer experience, risk within your supply chain, or just changing an IT system. Understanding the current state is an extremely important step before you move into solutioning and changing anything.
I'm so glad you shared that, and it is such an important point. I think you and I both have been in plenty of organizations, especially when you bring in as your process mapping, value stream mapping, journey mapping. I think you mentioned, as you bring in a cross-functional team, it amazes me just how often this office has no idea what this office is doing and why, right? And so immediately you uncover all of these eureka moments and these learnings that provide for almost instantaneous. I mean, some of the things provide for very simple changes that improve everyone's experience. So it really is important, that current state, and understanding that, and getting beyond the assumptions that so many people, I've certainly made it myself, that we make around how things currently work. So that is worth the price of admission, Dr. Troy Montgomery. Okay, so I bet you and I could talk for several more hours about 2020 and all the business takeaways. There's so many. We're just scratching the surface. But for the sake of time, I'm really interested about this next segment, because I uncovered something in the pre-show that I didn't glean from our earlier conversations. So let's talk about a business leader in particular that you draw inspiration from.
Yeah, and so this is one that most of the listeners probably aren't going to be familiar with, but they probably know somebody that fits this mold. And so that was my mother. She actually was a small business owner throughout my childhood, which allowed so much flexibility. But at the time, I never really appreciated what she had accomplished. So she had a consignment shop and had it for probably about 20 years before she ended up selling it right on the onset of eBay. And she recognized that this probably wasn't going to be the best business to be in at that time.
And what was your mother's name, by the way?
It's Judy Montgomery.
Judy Montgomery. Okay.
Yeah. So I grew up in Louisville, Kentucky, and that's where they still are. But my mother was a school teacher, so she was an undergrad and master's in education, and taught in primary school up until I was, probably 4 or 5 years old. So it was before I started in school that she started to test out a business idea, and that was used cribs. So in our basement, she would purchase, maybe at yard sales or through people that she knew, some used cribs, and she thought there was a market for this. So this is still while she was teaching. And she would have about 4 or so cribs in the basement and would put some ads out in the local newspaper. And she'd get a good amount of calls. So that started to, as she continued to test that idea, because we talk about this kind of lean startup approach within organizations, an innovative approach, and fail fast. And I realized, years after living through that's what she was doing. She was testing the market and identifying that, hey, yeah, there's a market for used cribs in this example. Then she partnered with a company right across the river in Indiana, about 45 minutes away, that was a manufacturer of cribs. So she partnered with them, was able to drive over and bring and have at least 1 or 2 new cribs in the basement as well. So this started to grow, and then eventually she leased out some space and was focused on baby furniture. But she needed something more to fill that space, so she started to include clothing, both baby and children clothing. And she set up a consignment store. And so she realized when she opened the store that it was really the clothing, not just the furniture that was driving sales. And over time, that became a very successful business. And a couple things that I really draw from that is being in supply chain now, just the significance of setting up the systems in place to bring in new product and then also get rid of inventory that's been sitting for a while. So she came up with a pretty good approach where she would sign a contract with individuals that would bring clothing in, and after a certain amount of days, a couple months, whatever it may be, she'd give the opportunity for them to come pick it up, or then it would go to some different charitable organizations that they partner with. So it became really a pillar of the community as well. So not only was it a successful business, but it was also a huge help to mothers who maybe couldn't afford going through the new clothes every few days, and they could make some money as they bring back the clothes that were gently used into the store. And then for me, growing up, I'd see her working in the afternoons and evenings, tagging clothes, and then working through the new inventory system. So this is in the late 80s, early 90s that we're talking about. And she was on the front of having an inventory management system in a consignment shop. She had her computer in the store and then a computer at home, and would bring those old floppy disks home to back up the information on the computer at home. So I think a number of your listeners can probably relate to the systems that were in place and utilizing probably not the most efficient tools, but at the time they were efficient. But then also just allowing the flexibility to serve the community, as well as still be mom and be at home with me and my sister as we continue to grow up.
I love that for so many different reasons. Of course, as an entrepreneur, it hits me, right in the heart, right? Because many of us can relate to that journey. But the intense focus on all the re's that's so important these days, right? Remanufacturing, recycling, reusing. There's only probably a handful, as you described that time period, the late 80s and early 90s. Clearly, there wasn't enough focus and smart people doing things in that regard during that time frame, which is sad, and that's kind of part of the reason where we are today, right? It's for so many, in so many different aspects of trying to really reach that circular economy. But to hear a trailblazer like your mother, Judy Montgomery, right?
Right.
To build a business model around that, while also, to your point, not only embracing those elements, but helping others and the folks that couldn't afford the new stuff. I mean, we're both fathers, and that new stuff is expensive. Those baby manufacturers and clothing manufacturers are very proud of their stuff, and they should be. But what a wonderful story and champion for many things that Judy Montgomery has been. So, and I know we're just scratching the surface probably on a lot of things and leadership lessons and business lessons you learned from your mother. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, and growing up seeing the business continue to grow was eye-opening as well. So she never had a significant amount of employees, but was managing 4 or 5 employees, and most of those employees were women and mothers as well. So seeing her flexibility in working with her team was extremely important, and something that I always remember. If there was a ball game or something came up for some of her employees, she was the first one to say, all right, well, I'm going to run into the store and take over the shift. And so it was amazing to see that and the relationships that she built, with her team as well.
Love that. Flexibility certainly has been a greater point of emphasis in 2020, which is neat. But it's all, the savviest leaders have always appreciated and exhibited and put an emphasis on the value of flexibility for their team members, whether it's going back to the industrial age, to where we are today, and of course moving forward. So I love so many different aspects of the story you're sharing about your mother's business. So we'll have to have her on down the road.
One more other thought on that is just the timing and the knowledge on when to exit the business. And she ended up selling the business, like I said, right around the onset of internet companies like eBay and other companies that were doing something similar to larger markets. So she had the wherewithal and the business knowledge to say, you know what, this is probably not the right time for her to dig into, an online retailer. And she wasn't willing to take the business that way. So it was time for her to exit. And she acknowledged that, recognized that, and thought there might be a better opportunity for another owner to come in and take over.
Love that. We got to pick our spots these days, right?
Yeah.
Or those days. Any days, you got to pick your spots. All right. So we've kind of ventured, first two topics here. We talked about 2020 and some of your key takeaways from a business standpoint that will probably be around for a long time in terms of lessons learned. We talked about Judy Montgomery, some of the lessons learned there from what a wonderful entrepreneurial story. There's so much there. We'll have to have her on. Now let's arrive as we start to wrap. Let's talk about what you're doing now. Let's do that twofold. I love how you've already shared some of your MO when it comes to educating and facilitating learning for your students. So, any additional thoughts there in terms of what's next as I guess we're halfway through the current semester. I'm not even sure how classes work these days. So speak to that if you would. And then also I want to talk a little bit more about how you're consulting organizations and helping them get through some tough to manage change.
Yeah, so regarding University of Georgia and Terry College of Business, we've got an excellent program in the management department with a supply chain and operations emphasis. So we've got about 125 top-notch students that are coming through that program where they study some of the fundamentals related to supply chain analytics, operations, project management. But more importantly for these students, they're also management majors. So they have a really good kind of cross-functional view of how to run, how to be a leader, within a business. So yeah, we're about halfway through the semester, and this semester has been odd as well as the last semester with a lot of online education. But again, I think this is going to be a shift within our higher education in providing more flexibility. I know for me personally, it's pushed me to have more variety in lectures, more variety in guest speakers coming in, variety of how the message is delivered, whether it's video or in person or online. So I think it's pushed me and probably most educators to think outside of the box. And when we come out of this pandemic on the other side, we're going to have a lot more tools and techniques to try to keep our students engaged. So yeah,
Excellent point.
Also within the University of Georgia, we've got a really strong executive education program where I partner with, this is also my business partner in my consulting firm, SC&E, Dr. Don Addison. So we partner together in delivering a lot of the same concepts to our students, both undergraduate and graduate, but more to the executive leaders, mid-level managers, and individuals that are out there fighting the good fight right now. Don, like myself, has a number of years of practical experience. He was a senior level executive at Bank of America for about 20 or 30 years, and then he retired and came on within the Institute of Leadership Advancement at UGA. So both Don and I provide an academic view, but also a practical view, having a significant amount of experience. So through the University of Georgia Executive Education Program, we've partnered to pull together a number of different opportunities, including leading change, which there's no shortage of change out there.
Right.
Project management, and then some of the continuous improvement, Lean Six Sigma skill sets that we previously mentioned. So we're staying pretty busy when it comes to educating the undergraduate, graduate students, and then also continuing to partner and work with organizations through executive education at UGA.
Love it. There's so much more there, but from a timing standpoint, we will start to wrap now. I really I like how you share, and again, I hate to keep going back to the classroom, but between communicating and where you put your focus and your points of emphasis and your overall MO, I bet just like I'll talk about Dan Berry, I'm 30 years ago, I guess. I bet students are going to be talking about Dr. Troy Montgomery in a very similar fashion. That and business leaders. I find your consulting journey to be fascinating as well. So a pleasure to sit down with you once again. It's been too long. Let's do it again. Maybe one of these next go rounds will include some of the incredibly bright folks that you have the chance to educate, but also probably learn from yourself, right?
Yes, absolutely, Scott. I appreciate you having me on, and look forward to connecting with anybody out there via LinkedIn or visit our website, www.scnepartners.com. Be happy to connect with individuals out there.
Wonderful. And we'll make sure that makes it into the show notes. We're after one click here as we try to, our listener experience, LX, we try to make sure it's as easy as possible for folks to connect with our guests and these remarkable journeys they're on. So, Dr. Troy Montgomery, a pleasure. Thanks so much for joining us. Again, faculty member with the Terry College of Business at UGA and managing partner of SC&E Partners. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me, Scott.
You bet. So, folks, if hopefully you've enjoyed this conversation as much as I have. It was kind of wide-ranging, but there's so much to talk about. There's so many. It's a fascinating time to be not just in global supply chain, but global business. And as Troy mentioned, leading through change. There's no shortage of it out there. So if you enjoyed this as much as I have, be sure to check out This Week in Business History. Subscribe wherever you get your podcast from. We offer a money-back guarantee. If you don't like the conversation, hey, we'll give you your money back. But on a serious note, thanks so much for joining us here today. Thanks so much for listening to our podcast series. Hey, on behalf of our entire team here at This Week in Business History and Supply Chain Now, Scott Luton signing off for now. Hey, do good, give forward, be the change that's needed. Be just like Judy Montgomery. And on that note, we'll see you next time here on This Week in Business History. Thanks, everybody.